Sometimes it's a bad law, or maybe just simple carelessness that can lead to really terrible consequences. As life shows us, many criminals probably could have been stopped before something irreparable happened. But unfortunately, sometimes luck is on their side. I mean, how else can you really explain this bloody massacre in France? Today we're going to talk about the events that shocked Savenol College. This was a prestigious private school, kind of like a boarding high school located in Chambon-sur-Lignon in the Haute-Loire region of France. It was a place where kids didn't just study, they also lived there full-time away from their parents. The town itself is a small commune with only about 2,000 people living there. So the school was really the most prominent thing in the area. The main part of the local community was connected to Savenol College. In some way, they either went to school there or they worked there. The school first opened back in 1938, and over its long history, it had seen a lot. But nothing was ever as bloody as what happened in 2011. That year, there were a lot of upheavals that, well, they played a major role, and it all ended in tragedy. Before we begin, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? And what's the weather like? Oh, and one more thing, what case do you want me to cover next? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And don't forget to subscribe. All right, enough talk, let's get into it. So, in 2011, the school was going through some serious financial problems. It was actually on the verge of bankruptcy, and the administration was trying everything they could to keep it going. And that makes sense because even with all the problems, it was still the most well-known school in the whole district. The college did operate under an agreement with the state, but the whole situation was very shaky. There were fewer and fewer students, which meant they were catastrophically short on money. And because of all that, the cost of tuition went down, and they started accepting pretty much anyone who applied without paying much attention to their records or their grades. The students who were there found themselves in this kind of limbo, basically risking not being able to graduate. This affected everybody, all the students, and it caused a huge amount of commotion and unhappiness among the families. And right in the middle of this whole crisis was a 13-year-old girl named Agnes Marin. She had transferred from another school just a short time before everything went wrong. Her parents, Frederick and Paula, felt that her previous school in Paris was having a bad influence on her. Apparently, she had gotten involved with a bad crowd there, and it was starting to affect her behavior. She got into some trouble with her teachers after she was caught smoking marijuana on the school playground. And a few times, she had lied to them, skipping class to go hang out with her friends. The teachers were critical of Agnes's behavior, and her school report wasn't great. But despite all that, the thing is, she had good grades in all of her subjects. She was a really conscious teenager who wanted to get an education and someday build a career as a director. So her mom and dad thought it was necessary to get her away from that bad company. And with that in mind, the parents sent in an application for her to go to Savenol College. Even with the behavioral issues in the school transfer, Agnes had a good relationship with her parents. Frederick and Paula really believed that studying at this college would be good for Agnes. So she changed schools and had to get used to a new class all over again. On top of that, there were some changes in the specialized program she was in, so she had to put a lot of attention on her studies. But honestly, that wasn't a problem for a smart kid like Agnes, who had always done well in school. During this time, her parents were working in the suburbs of Paris, and they would come to visit their daughter every 3 weeks. Agnes was a pleasant and pretty girl. She was kind, cheerful, and got along with people easily, so she had no trouble fitting in with the new group and making friends. Here too, she was noticed smoking in different places, but it seems like few people were bothered by it. At this new school, it just wasn't seen as a big deal. A lot of kids smoked wherever they wanted, and the staff didn't really seem to care if it was regular cigarettes or marijuana. The new school was on this really large piece of property. It was a whole campus surrounded by a forest. In the second half of the day, the students were usually free to do what they wanted, so the teenagers would get together and have fun just wandering around the area. Most of the time, they were left to their own devices, and without any real supervision, a lot of the students took advantage of the situation. On November 16th, 2011, all the students were in the cafeteria having lunch after their classes had finished. Chambon-sur-Lignon is a small town. To get from the campus to the center of town is maybe a 15-minute walk. Usually students would get together in a group and go for a walk and then come back to campus. That day, they all met up like they normally would and headed for the town's central square. Agnes was in the group as well. The students were all supposed to be back on campus by 4:30 in the afternoon. And just like always, all the students came back on time, or maybe a little late, but Agnes, she wasn't with them. Her disappearance was reported to the teachers right away, and they didn't waste any time. They called the police to report that the girl was missing. After the gendarmes got to the campus, they put together several groups made up of students, teachers, and law enforcement officers. They all went into the town and started combing the surrounding area, really hoping they would find the missing girl. But around midnight, they were all forced to head back to their dormitory, and it was getting dark, and it was time for the students to get ready for the next school day. Unfortunately, Agnes still couldn't be found, and there were no traces of the schoolgirl anywhere. The gendarmes kept combing the area, but that didn't lead to any results either. So, detectives started speaking with students from the girl's closest circle. And finally, a friend of Agnes, a girl named Estelle, approached them. She had actually been with Agnes on the day she disappeared. According to her, they met up at the main square right in the center of town. She said they walked together for a while and then went their separate ways around 2:30 in the afternoon. Her friend said she didn't see Agnes again after that. Now, Estelle didn't go to the same school, but the girls saw each other and talked all the time, and meetings like this were pretty common for them, so nothing seemed unusual about it. The gendarmes decided to speak with her again on November 17th. And that's when, unexpectedly, her story changed. This time, she told them that during their walk around town, Agnes had twisted her ankle. However, Estelle couldn't walk with her because she was in a hurry to get home. Apparently, her parents were waiting for her, but Agnes didn't ask for any help. It seemed that Agnes was going to meet some young man and, didn't need the company, so her friend simply left after they agreed on when they'd meet next. To the police officers, this story seemed suspicious. Her friend's lie just felt kind of unfounded. They couldn't understand why Estelle wouldn't have mentioned this young man right away. He could have been an important clue in the whole investigation. The officers latched on to this new information and tried to get more details from her, but she insisted she didn't have any. Estelle eventually admitted that she was forced to lie because Agnes was planning on doing something bad. So she'd asked her not to tell anyone anything about it. All of this just seemed even stranger, considering the girl had disappeared. Why would you cover for her now? A new theory started to form that maybe the heroine of our story had just run away from school, possibly because of some problems she was having. As a result, Estelle became a suspect herself because of her lies, and her alibi was checked very, very carefully. And pretty quickly, the teenager's story was confirmed. She had, in fact, headed straight home after their meeting. Along the way, she was even seen by some acquaintances. On the day Agnes disappeared, the two friends had been texting, making plans to meet up the next day. Agnes had been sending messages from her phone, but later on, it seems she turned it off. No one else could get a hold of her after that. Estelle just figured her battery had died and that Agnes herself had run away because she didn't like the school. Apparently, it was something she'd wanted to do for a long time, and this version of events was starting to sound more and more plausible. Trying to figure out which direction to even search for the girl, investigators discovered a young man from her text messages the same one Agnes was supposed to meet. He turned out to be a senior student, 17 years old at the time, named Matthew Molinos. What's more, his classmates confirmed that he and Agnes had appeared together on the very day she went missing, but the young man had an excuse. He said that he'd been using prohibited substances that day, and when the whole campus was out walking around town, he'd had too much to drink and fell into a blackberry bush, which is where he got badly scratched up. They decided to check his story by talking with other students. They confirmed that they had heard this story from Matthew, but nobody really believed it was true. According to eyewitnesses, He had come out of the forest near the campus at around 5 o'clock in the afternoon. At the time, everyone was surprised and didn't really get what he could have been doing in there, since everyone else was already back inside the building. When they started asking him about it, Matthew suddenly got furious and just lost his temper. All of this raised some serious suspicions, but the gendarmes didn't want to rush to any conclusions, so they began checking into the teenager's background. Matthew Molinos was from Nages et Solorgs, a place in Gard. He had 2 younger sisters. At school, the young man really stood out, seemed strange, and he kept to himself. He had this gothic style of clothing and openly promoted a rebellious lifestyle, defying parents and teachers. In the upper grades, he would often brag about how he was into internet hacking and also that he used illegal substances. The young man's grades were so poor that they had wanted to remove him from classes twice. And maybe the most harmless thing on his list of violations was that he was regularly watching adult films, even on the school computer. It was becoming clear that this boy's behavior was really on a downward spiral. He started having problems with the law, and against this backdrop, it seemed that the young man could quite possibly be involved in the schoolgirl's disappearance, and he became the main suspect. Law enforcement officers immediately noticed some oddities in his behavior. Many people described him as a boy with peculiarities. Matthew had been a student at the school since November of 2010. He would often go visit relatives on the weekends back in Gard, where his family's home was. The senior student also had a girlfriend there among the other students. They all apparently vacationed together a lot in the south of France. The young man loved playing video games, smoking marijuana, taking drugs, and he was also well acquainted with alcohol. Many claimed that when he was intoxicated, Matthew would stop behaving adequately, but that didn't stop him from drinking regularly or from even bringing alcohol into the school. Maybe he was just experiencing that transitional period of life more acutely than others. Matthew's behavior was very revealing. The gendarmes suspected right away that he was lying when they were asking him questions. So, the detectives decided to speak with him in more detail, and they started to gradually approach the subject of Agnes's disappearance. The young man admitted that he had seen her the day before she disappeared, but he claimed it was just a quick, fleeting encounter in the campus hallways. He said they didn't really speak, just kind of greeted each other as they passed by. According to him, he was planning to meet his girlfriend that day. Matthew denied having anything to do with the schoolgirl's disappearance, but even though he was persuasive, they decided to place him in custody until they could clarify all of the circumstances. At that point, the missing girl's parents had arrived in town. They started searching for their daughter. They spoke with journalists, and they put up flyers with her picture all over. Frederick and Paula spoke with a lot of people on the street, but they didn't learn anything valuable, in their opinion. Despite some recent behavioral problems, Agnes just didn't have a tendency to do something like this. On the contrary, she was a homebody and would never have just run away. The most she was capable of was maybe going out for a walk with friends. And if she really had just run away, she would have left some kind of trace. I mean, Agnes should have been caught on one of the surveillance cameras at the exits of the town. Or some random witness could have remembered seeing the girl. But for some reason, she remained completely unnoticed by everyone. Unfortunately, all of these search efforts were in vain. The public was getting more and more involved in what was happening. The gendarmes were actively speaking with any possible witnesses, Agnes's closest friends, and also her circle of friends from school. While Matthew was in custody, they searched his room in the campus dorm, and in there, some items of clothing were found that were very dirty, which looked suspicious. According to some of the witnesses, he was wearing those exact clothes on the day Agnes disappeared when he came out of the forest. The young man explained the dirt on his clothes by saying that he had fallen into a thorny bush, the same story he used to explain the scratches on his face and hands. However, these injuries looked more like defensive wounds, like he had clearly been in some kind of struggle. The clothes found in his room were taken to a lab for examination. The gendarmes decided to talk with the suspect again, and unexpectedly, his story started to change. The senior student admitted that he had, in fact, met with Agnes on that fatal day. He said he was planning to go with her to look for hallucinogenic mushrooms in the forest that surrounded the college. According to Matthew, he and his friend did manage to find what they wanted to try, and together they used all of it. On top of that, he said he'd also smoked marijuana, which made the effect even more intense. Based on his confession, he claimed that after this, he lost control of himself and fell into a blackberry bush, and then he just fell so far out of reality that he couldn't say what had happened to his friend. The schoolgirl had simply disappeared. When he came to his senses, he searched for Agnes in the forest for a little while, but couldn't find anything. In the end, he was forced to just return to campus alone because of the time. However, these words were disproven when the results of his blood analysis came back. There were no traces of mushrooms in his system at all. This meant he was simply lying. In response to new questions from the detectives, Matthew again started adding new details to his story. He now admitted that Agnes had fallen into the thorny bush with him. But at the same time, he kept the ending the same, that he had supposedly lost consciousness, and when he woke up, he didn't find his friend and just went back to the college. At the police station, the young man was with a lawyer who recommended he go back to that same place in the forest and show the detectives, but he refused. So the police officers decided to go on their own to the spot that Matthew had described, the one witnesses had pointed to when they saw him coming out of the forest. Large-scale searches were conducted in that area with helicopters, divers, and search dogs. And it all turned out to be worthwhile. But a scene of horror was waiting for them, something that shocked all the law enforcement officers. Until the very last moment, they had been hoping to find the girl alive and unharmed. Instead, they found a body in the forest. It was mutilated and partially charred. She was found half naked with obvious signs of rape. Her clothing was partially removed and pulled up, but not in a way that would happen from falling into some bushes. She had clearly been stripped and assaulted. The parents were immediately informed about the terrible outcome of the search. While the gendarmes returned from the interrogation room, the body was sent to the forensic medical examiner. Now came the moment to get a confession from the suspect. At this point, no one had any doubts about Matthew's guilt, and in fact, the young man didn't particularly resist. Based with the irrefutable evidence they'd found, he confessed to the murder quite quickly. First, they asked him why the victim's body was in such a horrible state. He told them that immediately after the rape and murder, he used a gas canister that he had with him. He managed to set the schoolgirl's clothing on fire, and after that, the juvenile criminal just left, hoping that the body would burn completely. But his expectations, fortunately, were not fulfilled. When he found himself alone with Agnes in the forest, he suddenly attacked her and decided to immobilize her. For this, he used his favorite toy, something he'd had with him since he was a Kita yo-yo. And it was at this moment that the struggle began, which is when Agnes scratched her attacker's face and hands. But he was much bigger, older, and stronger, so he was able to overpower the schoolgirl without much effort. Interestingly, that same yo-yo that he had used to tie the victim's hands, the young man later took it out and was just playing with it right there during the interrogations. It looked like he was clearly entertaining himself with it while he answered the investigators' questions. After the forensic medical examiner's report, even more disturbing details of this cruel attack were revealed. The torturer methodically and brutally beat the girl so severely that the heroine of our story had a broken left arm and both of her shins were broken. There could be no doubt about it, Matthew was the killer. The girl was buried in Paris on the day she was supposed to turn 14, November 26, 2011. A lot of caring people who came to support the family in their difficult time were there at the farewell ceremony. It turned out that Agnes was not Matthew's first victim. Back in August of 2010, there was an investigation into an attack on another girl. She turned out to be an acquaintance of Matthew's, a 15-year-old named Julie, who lived with her parents in Guard and was actually a neighbor of this monster. They had communicated for a long time, and the young man pretended to be her friend, although in reality, he had much more sinister plans for her. Shortly before the attack, he had borrowed 10 euros from her, and when he decided to return the money, he lured the girl to the nearest forest and tied her to a tree with shoelaces. All of this was done intentionally. The criminal had prepared for it ahead of time and taken everything he needed from his house. Julie was raped, but in this case, he didn't beat her. Perhaps he just didn't have time. According to the victim, she miraculously stayed alive, but only because of a call from her mother, who just had a feeling that her daughter was in danger. When the cell phone rang, Matthew stopped, got confused and scared, and he released her. Julie told the police everything, and the young man was arrested. He apparently cried during the interrogation at the station, trying to make them feel sorry for him. Julie was convinced that if it weren't for that lucky coincidence, she would have, without a doubt, become Matthew's first victim. Despite how serious the attack on Julie was, the young man didn't get the punishment he deserved. He spent 4 months in pretrial detention, and 4 different psychiatrists worked with him. One of the specialists came to the conclusion that Matthew had been completely rehabilitated and was no longer a danger to society. Based on that assessment, the judge released him from custody, but on the condition that he go through therapy and leave the region. The young man's family also put in a lot of effort to get him released. The senior students' parents visited about 20 different schools, just hoping that at least one of them would accept their son. He had been expelled from his previous school, but he still needed to get an education. Almost 20 of those requests were refused, until the family turned to the college where Agnes would later enroll. All of this just seemed absurd, since the school was mostly for girls between the ages of 13 and 17. It was just incomprehensible how an educational institution could accept a young man who had these kinds of problems with the law, specifically for violence. Obviously, the only way he could have been admitted to a place like that was if they didn't look into the troubled teenager's past at all. According to the director, he had no right to dig into a student's past, and he said no warnings from law enforcement about Matthew had ever been received. The story he was told was that the son's past problems were just from a bad breakup with a girlfriend who had supposedly decided to get revenge on him by reporting a rape. The school director believed him, so the troubled teenager's father deliberately lied to get him into the school, which is what led to the brutal massacre of Agnes. Detectives concluded that accepting a potentially dangerous person into the student body was really all about money. During this period, the college was having serious funding problems, and they needed 13,000 euros a year for each student. So Matthew's acceptance had a purely economic justification. The school's management wasn't really all that interested in who would be studying there. The main thing was that there were students. All of this just seemed unthinkable. The trial against Matthew was extremely controversial, and it caused a huge amount of debate with the public. The killer's mother and father, the college management, and the law enforcement agencies all came under a great deal of pressure. According to the country's law, minors who commit serious crimes are tried in a closed court format. But the victims' relatives insisted that they wanted to make the hearings at least partially open. The idea was that journalists would be present at the key stages of the trial, because this would allow the real essence of the problem to be publicized and to help everyone understand who exactly was to blame for what happened. At the time of the murder, Matthew had just a little more than a month left until he was technically an adult. But the law is the law, and his defense team could demand a closed trial. And that's what they did. The request for partially open hearings was denied. Interestingly, the psychiatrist who had decided the young man was rehabilitated after the attack on the first girl, the one who said he posed no danger, had actually never dealt with criminal offenders or crimes of a sexual nature before. In fact, this was a novice specialist who just didn't have the right qualifications and couldn't fully assess the patient's condition. Other psychiatrists who took part in the examination really emphasized that Matthew seemed inadequate. He behaved unpredictably and dangerously. The schoolboy was completely uninterested in what was happening. He felt no remorse, and he practically ignored any attempts by the specialists to reach him. He would often let himself get aggressive toward them, even making threats when he'd lose his temper out of nowhere. It seemed like he had no empathy, which is something he admitted himself. According to the juvenile criminal, he had felt some kind of impulse over and over again that pushed him toward crime. The first girl became a victim of that same impulse. And then this fate befell Agnes as well. Eventually, after the murder, he went through a full psychiatric examination. Matthew was diagnosed with paranoid and schizoid disorder. The assumption was that he was extremely dangerous to society, but he was still recognized as sane and capable of standing trial. Considering his age when he committed the crime, the killer was supposed to be tried as a minor, which would have meant a softer punishment. However, it was decided to try him as an adult because of how cruel the crime was. Following the trial on June 28th, 2013, Matthew was sentenced to life in prison for the rape and attack on Julie, as well as for the rape and murder of Agnes. This was actually only the second time in French history that a minor received a life sentence. His lawyer disagreed with this, especially because the defendant had never gotten the appropriate treatment. I mean, the specialist diagnosis clearly indicated that he was sick. And because of this, the defense attorney filed an appeal. Matthew was supposed to be tried again in September of 2014. And these hearings became even more painful for the deceased family. This was largely because of the criminal's own behavior. At the second trial, he spoke much more often and more confidently. He admitted that he had always enjoyed seeing people suffer. The defendant stated that after he murdered Agnes, he had been in a state of euphoria for a long time and felt an urge to commit similar crimes. It became obvious that if Matthew hadn't been detained, he would have killed again. Against the backdrop of these statements, the jury confirmed the original verdict. After this, the lawyer decided to file another appeal, believing the sentence was just too harsh. This appeal was rejected. On February 7th, 2014, Agnes's parents filed a complaint against the state for gross negligence. They believe that because of the psychiatrist's mistake, the judge's error, and just the system in general, a dangerous criminal had been released and had attacked their daughter. And all the people who were involved in what happened had not received the punishment they deserved. The Supreme Court of Paris considered the case and ruled in the girl's family's favor. For the criminal negligence, it was decided to pay them compensation in the amount of 185,000 euros. Despite this being only a weak consolation, the parents' goal wasn't really about the money. What the murdered girl's relatives wanted was to show the imperfections in the judicial and law enforcement system and to hopefully influence its review. Savenol College was finally closed in 2014. In reality, it simply went bankrupt, especially after the loud scandal involving them enrolling a potentially dangerous criminal. The position of Matthew's relatives was unenviable from the very beginning, considering that at the time he committed the crime, they were still legally responsible for him. And facts were also revealed that showed the criminal's father had played a major role in getting him released and admitted to the college. The family found itself under a lot of public pressure. People believed that everything that happened was a consequence of them covering for the criminal, which is what led to the tragedy. The parents should have organized forced treatment for their son in a psychiatric clinic and then made sure there was supervision for a teenager who'd been pulled out from under arrest. Instead, the mother and father just sent their son to a school far from home, where essentially no one was there to look after him. And so, in the public's opinion, the parents indirectly bear some responsibility for the murder. Some people, however, believe that this particular case was more of an exception to the rule. Matthew was mentally ill, and his parents were desperately trying to help their child to socialize him and integrate him into society, not suspecting just how dangerous he actually was. At least, the parents themselves made similar statements. and they made them everywhere they possibly could. They appeared on practically all the popular French television channels and used every form of mass media they could. Matthew's mother and father even wrote a book about their family's life. This case was tough, but what you're seeing on the screen right now, there's no way I could edit that one without tearing up. Tears literally hit my keyboard. You have to watch it next. Seriously.